Nathan Porter stepped out of his car, taking a deep breath of the crisp autumn air. The cul-de-sac of Harmony Estates was quiet, with neat rows of pastel-colored houses framed by trimmed hedges and flower beds. It was exactly the kind of place he had dreamed of living when he accepted the position of police chief in Oak Ridge. After years of working in chaotic urban environments, he was ready for a fresh start. He adjusted his tie, a habit he hadn't shaken even after swapping his uniform for casual slacks and a button-up shirt. Grabbing the first box from the car, he turned toward his new home, a cozy two-story house with a wraparound porch. As he approached the front door, a flicker of movement caught his eye. Across the street, a curtain swayed, and he caught a glimpse of a woman peeking through her window. Nathan smiled politely and gave a small wave, but the curtain snapped shut. Inside the house, Linda Myers felt her chest tighten. She had seen the moving van pull up earlier but hadn't expected him. The man didn't look like anyone else in the neighborhood. Her stomach churned with unease, a feeling she couldn't quite explain but one she justified by saying, "I'm just being cautious." As a lifelong resident of Harmony Estates, she prided herself on knowing everyone on the street. This man was a stranger. And strangers, she thought, brought trouble. Her husband, Mark, glanced up from the dining table. "What's got you so worked up?" he asked, setting aside the crossword puzzle he had been working on. "There's a new guy moving in," Linda replied, her voice tight. "I don't recognize him. And, well, something just feels off." Mark raised an eyebrow. "Linda, it's probably nothing. New people move in all the time. Don't overthink it." But Linda couldn't shake her unease. By mid-afternoon, she found herself picking up the phone. "Hello? Yes, I'd like to report something suspicious." The officers arrived quickly, Harmony Estates being a quiet neighborhood where police calls were rare. Their squad car pulled into the cul-de-sac, lights flashing but sirens off. Linda watched nervously from behind her lace curtains, her fingers gripping the fabric tightly. Mark, her husband, had moved into the living room, shooting her a skeptical look as he caught sight of the patrol car. "Linda, what did you do?" he asked, his voice low and disapproving. "I just asked them to check it out," Linda muttered, defensive. "It's better to be safe, isn't it?" Mark sighed heavily, shaking his head. "You don't even know him. He could be anyone, a teacher, a doctor." Linda ignored him, peering outside as the officers stepped out of the car. They exchanged a brief word with one another before approaching the driveway where Nathan was unloading a box from his car. Nathan noticed them immediately. The flashing lights were hard to miss. Setting down the box, he turned to face them, his expression calm but slightly puzzled. He wasn't sure what they were there for, but years in law enforcement had taught him to remain composed in such situations. "Good afternoon, officers," Nathan said as they approached. "Is there a problem?" The younger officer, clearly uncomfortable, hesitated before speaking. "We received a call about someone new in the neighborhood. Just wanted to check things out." Nathan raised an eyebrow but kept his tone steady. "I see. Well, I'm Nathan Porter. Just moved in today." He extended a hand to the older officer, who took it reluctantly. "I'll save you some radio time," Nathan added with a small smile. "You'll find me in your personnel files. I'm your new chief." The younger officer's face turned beet red, and the older officer stiffened slightly, glancing at his partner before clearing his throat. Chief Porter. Sir, we weren't aware you'd moved in already." "Well, here I am," Nathan replied. "Do you mind telling me who called this in? I'd like to clear up any confusion." The officers exchanged an uncomfortable glance. "I don't think that's necessary, Chief," the older officer said. "Probably just a misunderstanding. We'll let you get back to your move." Nathan watched as they returned to their car, the younger officer looking like he wanted to sink into the ground. As the squad car pulled away, he looked up, and for the first time, his eyes locked with Linda's through her curtain. She froze, quickly pulling the fabric shut. Nathan shook his head and returned to his unpacking. He had hoped for a fresh start, but it seemed even in a peaceful neighborhood like Harmony Estates, old assumptions and prejudices still lingered. Linda woke early the next morning, feeling uneasy. The events of the previous day weighed heavily on her. She hadn't expected the man to be the new police chief, and now that she knew, embarrassment and guilt gnawed at her. What would the neighbors think if they found out? Would Nathan confront her? The thought made her stomach churn. She peeked outside her window. hoping to catch a glimpse of the new neighbor without being noticed. Nathan's car was parked in the driveway, and the front door was open. He was carrying a large plant to the porch, setting it down with care. He looked normal, friendly, even. Mark shuffled into the kitchen, still in his pajamas. He poured himself a cup of coffee, shooting Linda a knowing look. "Still spying on the neighbor you called the cops on?" he asked. His tone edged with sarcasm. "I wasn't spying," Linda replied sharply, "and I didn't know he was the police chief." "That's the point," Mark said, sipping his coffee. "You didn't know anything about him, but you jumped to conclusions. Don't you think you owe the man an apology?" Linda bristled at the suggestion. "I was just trying to be cautious. You know I didn't mean any harm." Mark shrugged. "Intent doesn't erase impact." Linda said nothing, retreating to the living room. The thought of apologizing made her nervous. What if Nathan didn't accept it? What if he told the other neighbors about what she'd done? She paced the room, torn between guilt and pride. By midday, Nathan had settled into his new home, but the lingering tension from the previous day remained. He noticed the neighbors watching him from their windows, their curiosity evident. He didn't blame them for being cautious, but the incident with the police had left a sour taste in his mouth. As someone who had spent years working to bridge divides in his previous community, Nathan knew that the road to understanding was often bumpy. He also knew that confronting bias head-on could lead to meaningful change, but only if people were willing to listen. Sitting on his porch with a cup of coffee, he decided to take the first step. He wasn't going to let this incident define his relationship with his new neighbors. If the community was hesitant to reach out to him, he would meet them halfway. That evening, Nathan drafted an email to the Harmony Estates Neighborhood Association, introducing himself and suggesting a community meeting. He framed it as an opportunity to get to know each other better and discuss how they could work together to make the neighborhood an even better place to live. The email was polite and professional, but it also carried an underlying challenge. Nathan wanted to address the elephant in the room, prejudice and assumptions, without alienating anyone. He hoped the meeting would be the start of a conversation, not just about him but about the kind of community Harmony Estates wanted to be. By the time he hit send, Nathan felt a renewed sense of purpose. Change wouldn't happen overnight, but it had to start somewhere. The email invitation landed in every Harmony Estates resident's inbox early the next morning. It was short and to the point. Subject: Neighborhood Welcome and Discussion. Dear neighbors, my name is Nathan Porter, and I recently moved into Harmony Estates. I'm excited to be a part of this community and look forward to getting to know each of you better. I'd like to invite you to a casual gathering at the community center this Friday evening at 7 p.m. It will be a chance to introduce ourselves, discuss ways to make our neighborhood even more welcoming, and share ideas about fostering a stronger sense of community. I hope to see you there. Best regards, Nathan Porter. Linda Myers stared at the email on her laptop, her heart sinking. She had hoped the incident with the police would quietly fade away. But it was clear Nathan wasn't going to let it slide, not in an accusatory way, but in a way that made her feel exposed. She pushed her coffee aside and called her friend Carol, another longtime resident of the neighborhood. "Did you see the email from the new guy?" Linda asked. "Yes," Carol replied, her tone neutral. "Are you going?" "I don't know," Linda said, biting her lip. "I feel like he's doing this because of what happened yesterday." "Well, maybe it's a good thing," Carol said carefully. "You could apologize. It sounds like he just wants to start fresh." Linda bristled but didn't argue. Deep down, she knew Carol was right. Still, the thought of showing up and admitting her mistake in front of everyone made her stomach churn. By 6:45 p.m. on Friday, the community center parking lot was beginning to fill. Nathan arrived early to set up the space. He arranged chairs in a semicircle and placed a table with coffee and cookies near the entrance. The setup was simple, intentionally non-intimidating. As the clock neared 7 p.m., neighbors trickled in, some chatting quietly while others glanced around awkwardly. Linda arrived with Mark, her hands clutching her purse tightly. She avoided Nathan's eyes as they walked past him. By 7:05, about 30 residents had gathered. Nathan stood at the front of the room, dressed casually in a sweater and slacks. He smiled warmly, taking in the group before beginning. "Good evening, everyone," he started. "Thank you for taking the time to come tonight. I know we all have busy schedules, so I appreciate you being here. I wanted to take this opportunity to introduce myself and share a little about why I'm here." Nathan paused, scanning the room. Most faces were attentive, though a few looked skeptical. "As some of you know, I'm the new police chief in Oak Ridge. I've spent the last 15 years working in law enforcement. And one of the most important lessons I've learned is that strong communities are built on trust, understanding, and communication. That's why I wanted to meet with all of you, not just as your neighbor, but as someone who believes we all play a role in shaping the kind of place we want to live." There was a murmur of agreement from a few people. Nathan continued, his tone steady but firm. "Sometimes, misunderstandings happen," he said, "and sometimes, those misunderstandings are based on assumptions we don't even realize we're making. That's something I've seen not just in my work but in everyday life. I believe we have an opportunity here to talk about those assumptions and how we can challenge them, not to blame or shame anyone, but to grow as a community." Linda's face flushed. She knew his words weren't directed at her specifically, but they hit close to home. She shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Nathan went on to share stories from his previous work in larger cities, where bridging divides had been essential to building trust. He spoke about how small acts of connection, like sharing stories or working on projects together, could dissolve barriers and bring people closer. "Tonight," he concluded, "I'd love to hear from all of you. What makes Harmony Estates special? What could make it even better? And how can we work together to ensure this neighborhood feels like home for everyone?" The room was silent for a moment. Then, Sarah Patel, a young mother sitting near the back, raised her hand. "I think this is a great idea," she said. "I moved here last year, and while everyone's been polite, it's been hard to feel like part of the community. I'd love to see more events that bring us together." Others began chiming in, offering suggestions for block parties, volunteer projects, and neighborhood watch programs. The atmosphere grew warmer as people shared ideas, but the underlying tension remained. Finally, Linda raised her hand. Her voice trembled slightly as she spoke. I'd like to say something," she began. All eyes turned to her, and she felt her throat tighten. "When Mr. Porter, Nathan, moved in, I made an assumption. I called the police because I thought something was wrong, and I didn't stop to consider that maybe I was wrong." The room was silent. Nathan watched her, his expression neutral but attentive. "I just want to say I'm sorry," Linda continued, her voice breaking slightly. "It wasn't fair. And it wasn't right. I've been thinking a lot about it, and I know I need to do better." Nathan smiled gently. "Thank you, Linda. That takes courage to say. And for what it's worth, I appreciate your honesty. This is exactly the kind of conversation I hope we could have tonight." The tension in the room eased as people nodded and murmured their support. Linda sat down, her face red but her shoulders lighter. For the first time in days, she felt a sense of relief. As the crowd dispersed, Nathan stayed to chat with neighbors. Linda approached him hesitantly, Mark by her side. "I just wanted to say thank you," she said, "for being so understanding." Nathan nodded. "We all make mistakes, Linda. What matters is what we do next." As they left, Nathan felt a sense of accomplishment. The meeting was only a small step, but it was a step in the right direction. He knew there was more work to do, both in the neighborhood and within himself, but he was ready for the journey. The following morning, Harmony Estates felt different. Conversations sparked at mailboxes, on porches, and during morning walks with neighbors reflecting on the meeting. While many praised Nathan's approach, a few grumbled privately about the necessity of such a discussion. Linda Myers, however, woke up feeling lighter than she had in weeks. Her apology, though nerve-wracking, had been well received, and for the first time, she felt hopeful about moving forward. She resolved to learn more about the biases she carried and how they had shaped her actions. Her husband, Mark, noticed the change. "You seem less stressed this morning," he commented over breakfast. "I just feel like I've taken the first step," Linda admitted, "but I can't stop there. I was thinking about asking Nathan if there's something I can do to help." Mark raised an eyebrow but smiled. "I think that's a great idea." Meanwhile, Nathan began planning his next steps. While the meeting had been productive, he knew it was only the beginning. Changing hearts and minds would take time, and there would undoubtedly be setbacks. His goal was clear: build trust, encourage open dialogue, and foster a sense of belonging for everyone in the neighborhood. A new initiative. 1 week later, Nathan sent out another email to the neighborhood. Subject: Community Volunteer Project. Dear neighbors, thank you again for attending last week's meeting and sharing your thoughts. As many of you mentioned, building a stronger community starts with working together. With that in mind, I'd like to invite you to our first volunteer project, a cleanup and revitalization of Harmony Park. The park is a central part of our neighborhood, and with a little effort, it can become an even better space for all of us to enjoy. Whether you can spare an hour or the whole afternoon, we'd love to have you join us. When? Saturday, 9 a.m. to 3 p.m. Where? Harmony Park. Let's roll up our sleeves and make a difference together. Best, Nathan. The email sparked a buzz in the neighborhood. Some residents were eager to help, while others saw the initiative as unnecessary. Greg Jacobs, a father of 3 and one of Nathan's more vocal skeptics, scoffed at the idea. Do we really need to spend a Saturday cleaning up the park? He grumbled to his wife. Karen, it's fine the way it is. Karen, who had attended the meeting and been moved by Nathan's message, shook her head. It's not just about the park. Greg, it's about bringing people together. You should give it a chance. I don't know, Greg muttered, but Karen's words lingered in his mind. Saturday morning dawned clear and sunny. The perfect day for outdoor work. By 9 a.m., a small group of neighbors had gathered at Harmony Park, including Linda and Mark, Sarah Patel and her kids, and even Carol. Nathan was already there, setting up supplies, gloves, trash bags, paint, and brushes. Good morning, everyone. Nathan greeted the group with a warm smile. Thank you for coming out. We've got a lot to do, but with your help, I'm sure we can make this park shine. The group divided into teams. Some focused on picking up litter, while others painted the faded benches and repaired broken picnic tables. Nathan moved between the teams, chatting with neighbors and lending a hand wherever needed. Around 10:30 a.m., Greg arrived, reluctantly dragging a rake behind him. Karen had convinced him to come, and though he still felt unsure about the whole thing, he couldn't deny the growing sense of curiosity. Nathan noticed Greg's arrival and approached him with a friendly nod. Glad you could make it. Greg, we're working on clearing out the overgrown weeds near the playground. Care to join me? Greg hesitated but eventually nodded. As they worked side by side, Nathan kept the conversation light, asking about Greg's family and how long he had lived in Harmony Estates. Slowly, Greg began to relax. By lunchtime, the group had made significant progress. The benches gleamed with fresh coats of paint. The playground was free of weeds, and the park looked cleaner than it had in years. Nathan set out sandwiches and drinks for everyone, and the volunteers gathered under the shade of an old oak tree to eat and chat. Linda found herself sitting next to Sarah Patel. Though they had been neighbors for over a year, they had never spoken much. Your kids are adorable, Linda said, watching Sarah's 2 children chase each other across the grass. Thank you, Sarah replied with a smile. It's nice to finally meet you properly. I think this project was a great idea. I agree, Linda said. It's helping me see things differently. Nearby, Greg was talking with Nathan, who had a knack for drawing people out of their shells. I'll admit, Greg said, I wasn't sure about this whole thing. But seeing everyone come together, it's hard not to feel like we're doing something good. That's the goal, Nathan replied. It's not just about the park, it's about building connections. When we work together, we start to see each other differently. Greg nodded thoughtfully, feeling the truth of Nathan's words. The cleanup project marked a turning point for Harmony Estates. Over the weeks that followed, neighbors who had once kept to themselves began waving hello on the street or striking up conversations at the local coffee shop. Linda started attending book clubs and workshops on diversity, eager to learn more about how she could grow. Greg, inspired by his conversation with Nathan, volunteered to help organize the next community event. But not everyone embraced the changes. A small group of residents remained skeptical, grumbling about the focus on inclusion and the unnecessary projects. Nathan expected this resistance and remained patient. He knew that change was a process, not a destination. One evening, Greg approached Nathan after a neighborhood meeting. Can I talk to you for a minute? He asked. Of course, Nathan said, gesturing for Greg to sit beside him on a bench outside the community center. I've been thinking about what you said at the park, Greg began, about how we all have blind spots. I didn't want to admit it before, but I think I've been holding on to some assumptions about people. I'm not proud of it, but I want to do better. I just don't know where to start. Nathan smiled, his respect for Greg growing. The fact that you're willing to admit that is a huge step. He said, change starts with awareness. From there, it's about listening, learning, and being open to new perspectives. Greg nodded, his expression serious. I want to be part of this. For my kids, if nothing else, they deserve to grow up in a better world. Over the following weeks, the changes in Harmony Estates became more apparent. The community cleanup had sparked a sense of pride and camaraderie among the residents who participated. Conversations that once felt awkward and guarded now came more naturally. Nathan Porter's quiet leadership and genuine willingness to connect with his neighbors were beginning to shift the tone of the neighborhood. Linda Myers was among those who felt the impact the most. She had started reading about unconscious bias and reflecting on how her own upbringing had shaped her worldview. One afternoon, she approached Nathan as he worked on his garden. Nathan, she began, clutching a plate of freshly baked cookies. I just wanted to say thank you for being patient with me. I've been doing a lot of thinking, and I realize I have a lot to learn. I hope it's not too late to make things right. Nathan smiled warmly, accepting the cookies. Linda, it's never too late. The fact that you're willing to grow says a lot. And, honestly, it's been great getting to know you and Mark. Linda's heart lightened at his words. She left that day feeling more hopeful than she had in years. Determined to keep growing. Despite the positive momentum, not everyone in Harmony Estates was comfortable with the changes. A small but vocal group of residents began to push back against Nathan's efforts. Greg Jacobs found himself caught between the two worlds. On one hand, he was slowly warming to Nathan's vision of community, on the other. His old friends often criticized the new direction. I just don't get why everything has to be about race, complained John Whitaker, one of Greg's closest neighbors. Over a beer on Greg's porch. We never had these problems before Nathan showed up. Greg hesitated, choosing his words carefully. I don't think he's trying to make it about race. John, he's just asking us to think about how we treat each other, and honestly, I think he's got a point. Look at the park cleanup. That brought everyone together. John scoffed. Yeah, for now. But what happens when we can't say anything without being accused of being a bigot? I'm telling you, Greg, it's a slippery slope. Greg sighed, realizing the conversation was going nowhere. As John left, Greg stared at his drink. Feeling torn, he respected Nathan and appreciated what he was doing for the community. But the resistance from people like John made it clear that not everyone was ready to embrace change. The tension came to a head at the next neighborhood meeting. Nathan had called the meeting to discuss plans for a cultural fair, an idea proposed by Sarah Patel to celebrate the diversity of the neighborhood. The event would feature food, music, and traditions from various cultures, creating an opportunity for neighbors to share and learn from one another. I think this could be a wonderful way to bring us closer together, Sarah said enthusiastically as she presented the idea. We have so many different backgrounds here, and this is a chance to celebrate them. While many residents nodded in agreement, others looked skeptical. John Whitaker stood up, his voice sharp. I don't see why we need something like this. We've been getting along fine without dividing ourselves into groups. Why can't we just leave things the way they are? Nathan stepped in, his tone calm but firm. John, I hear your concern, but this isn't about dividing anyone, it's about coming together. Celebrating our differences doesn't mean we're separate. It means we're stronger because of what each of us brings to the table. And what if some of us don't want to participate? John shot back. No one is being forced to do anything. Nathan replied, but I think if you give it a chance, you'll see how much we can learn from one another. The room was tense, but Greg stood up next. I was skeptical too, he admitted, surprising everyone, but after the park cleanup, I realized how much better things are when we work together. I think this fair could be another step in the right direction. John muttered something under his breath but sat down, arms crossed. The rest of the meeting proceeded with cautious optimism, and the cultural fair was approved. As the date for the cultural fair approached, the neighborhood buzzed with activity. Residents volunteered to set up booths, cook dishes, and share stories about their heritage. Even those who had been hesitant, like Greg, found themselves swept up in the excitement. Linda decided to contribute by baking a batch of cookies using her grandmother's recipe, which had been passed down for generations. It felt like a small way to honor her family's history and connect with others. When the day of the fair arrived, Harmony Park was transformed. Colorful decorations adorned the trees, and the air was filled with the scent of spices, grilled meats, and baked goods. Booths lined the pathways, each showcasing a different culture, from Indian samosas to Italian pasta, from African drumming to traditional Japanese tea ceremonies. Nathan walked through the crowd, his heart swelling with pride. The fair was more than he could have hoped for. Neighbors who had barely spoken before were now laughing, sharing food, and learning about each other's lives. Linda, who had spent much of the day at her booth, found herself drawn to a table displaying West African artifacts and crafts. The booth's owner, a warm-hearted woman named Adeline, greeted her with a smile. "These are beautiful," Linda said, admiring the intricate beadwork on a bracelet. "Thank you," Adeline replied. "They're part of my family's history. We came to this country 20 years ago, but we've always held onto our traditions." As they talked, Linda realized how little she had known about Adeline, despite living just a few streets away. By the end of their conversation, Linda felt a genuine connection, a reminder of why she had been so determined to change. The success of the cultural fair brought renewed energy to Harmony Estates. But the road to unity was far from smooth. While many residents embraced the spirit of inclusion, others, like John Whitaker, remained resistant, grumbling about how politics had taken over the neighborhood. Nathan, ever patient, continued to lead by example. He reached out to skeptics individually, listening to their concerns and gently challenging their assumptions. Some, like Greg, came around over time. Others, like John, remained entrenched in their views. Despite the setbacks, the progress was undeniable. New friendships blossomed, and the sense of isolation that had once defined the neighborhood began to fade. Harmony Estates was becoming a place where people didn't just coexist, they connected. Months later, as Nathan stood on his porch watching neighbors chat and laugh at the park across the street, he reflected on how far the community had come. The work wasn't finished, there were still biases to confront, bridges to build, and hearts to open, but the foundation had been laid. Nathan knew that change was a journey, not a destination, and in Harmony Estates, that journey had only just begun. While the cultural fair had been a triumph, Nathan knew that change wasn't linear. The positive momentum was encouraging, but it also surfaced new tensions that simmered beneath the surface. As Harmony Estates grew more diverse, attracting younger families, renters, and people from different cultural backgrounds, some longtime residents began feeling uneasy. For them, the neighborhood they had known for decades seemed to be changing too quickly. One day, Linda Myers stopped Nathan on his morning walk. She looked concerned, clutching a flyer in her hand. "Nathan, I wanted to talk to you about this," she said, handing it over. The flyer read, "Keep Harmony Estates traditional. Say no to big changes." Nathan frowned as he scanned the text. It was vague, but the message was clear. The flyer called for residents to resist efforts to alter the character of the neighborhood and instead preserve its legacy. It encouraged residents to attend an upcoming meeting organized by a group calling itself Harmony First. "Who's behind this?" Nathan asked. Linda sighed. "I think it's John Whitaker and a few others. I heard him talking about it at the coffee shop yesterday. He's saying the changes we're making are ruining Harmony Estates." Nathan nodded slowly, tucking the flyer into his pocket. "Thank you for bringing this to me, Linda. I'll look into it." He wasn't surprised by John's resistance. It had been brewing since the first town hall meeting. But now it was clear that John was taking a more active stance, and Nathan would have to address it head-on. The meeting organized by Harmony First took place the following week in John Whitaker's backyard. About 20 residents attended, most of them older, longtime homeowners. The tone of the discussion was tense and defensive. "This neighborhood used to be a quiet, friendly place," John said, pacing in front of the group. "Now we've got people coming in, telling us how to live, pushing their agendas. It's not right." A few people nodded in agreement, though others looked uncomfortable. Greg Jacobs, who had reluctantly attended at John's urging, raised his hand. "John, no one's trying to take anything away from us," Greg said. "The changes Nathan's brought to the neighborhood are about inclusion, not division. Look at the cultural fair. That brought everyone together." John waved him off. "You're missing the point, Greg. This is about protecting what we have. If we keep bending over backward to accommodate every new idea, we'll lose what makes Harmony Estates special." Greg shook his head but said nothing further, realizing he was outnumbered in the group. News of the Harmony First meeting spread quickly. Some residents voiced their concerns to Nathan directly, while others avoided the topic altogether. Nathan decided it was time to address the growing divide before it deepened further. He sent out another email, inviting the neighborhood to a listening session at the community center. His goal was simple: create a space where everyone could voice their concerns and, hopefully, find common ground. The meeting was well attended, with a mix of supporters, skeptics, and those who simply wanted to see how things would unfold. Nathan began by acknowledging the unease some residents were feeling. "I understand that change can be uncomfortable," he said. "It's natural to want to hold on to what feels familiar. But I also believe that we can embrace new ideas without losing the heart of what makes Harmony Estates special." John Whitaker stood up, his tone combative. "With all due respect, Chief Porter, it feels like you're asking us to change everything. Some of us moved here because we liked the way things were. Why should we have to give that up?" Nathan met John's gaze, his tone calm but firm. "John, I hear you, and I want to be clear. This isn't about taking anything away. It's about making sure that everyone, longtime residents and newcomers alike, feels welcome and valued. Harmony Estates can only thrive if it's a place where everyone belongs." The room was silent for a moment. Then Sarah Patel spoke up. "I moved here because I wanted a better life for my kids. I love this neighborhood, but it's hard to feel welcome when people see us as outsiders. That's why these changes matter." Greg added, "I'll admit, I was skeptical at first too. But the more I've gotten to know my neighbors, their stories, their experiences, the more I've realized how much richer our community is because of our differences." The discussion continued, with residents sharing their hopes, fears, and frustrations. By the end of the meeting, the room felt lighter, as though a weight had been lifted. Not everyone agreed, but the dialogue was a step toward understanding. Despite the progress made at the listening session, tensions flared again a few weeks later when a newcomer, a single mother named Elena Cruz, moved into the neighborhood. Elena, a Latina woman with 2 young children, rented a small house on the edge of Harmony Estates. Almost immediately, whispers began circulating. "She doesn't even own the house." One resident muttered to another at the grocery store. "What kind of people are we attracting now?" Nathan heard about the comments through Linda, who had befriended Elena and was furious on her behalf. "It's not fair," Linda said. "She's a wonderful person, and her kids are sweethearts. Why can't people see that?" Nathan decided to visit Elena personally to offer his support. He knocked on her door one evening and was greeted warmly. "I heard you've had a rough start here," Nathan said. "I want you to know you're not alone." Elena sighed, her eyes weary. "It's been hard. I moved here to give my kids a better life. But it feels like some people don't want us here." Nathan nodded. "Unfortunately, change isn't easy for everyone. But I promise you, there are people in this neighborhood who see you for who you are, not for where you came from. We'll keep working on the rest." Nathan decided to address the issue head-on at the next community meeting. He invited Elena to share her story, hoping it would help humanize her in the eyes of the skeptics. When Elena stood up to speak, her voice was steady but emotional. "I moved here because I wanted my kids to grow up in a safe, welcoming place," she said. "I know we're new, and I know we're renters. But we're not just passing through. This is our home now. And we want to be part of this community." Her words resonated with many in the room, including Greg, who later approached Elena to apologize for not reaching out sooner. Even Linda, who had already been working to undo her old biases, felt a renewed sense of responsibility to advocate for inclusion. The challenges in Harmony Estates didn't disappear overnight, but each new hurdle brought opportunities for growth. Nathan continued to lead with patience and empathy, knowing that true change required persistence. Over time, more residents began to see the value of the neighborhood's diversity, not as a threat, but as a strength. Harmony Estates became a place where people didn't just live near one another, they lived with one another, sharing their stories, their struggles, and their dreams. And though there were still moments of tension and resistance, the foundation of trust and understanding grew stronger with each passing day. For Nathan, the journey was far from over. But as he stood on his porch one evening, watching neighbors gather at the now thriving Harmony Park, he felt a deep sense of pride. This was the community he had hoped for, a community that embraced its challenges and grew stronger because of them. John Whitaker sat on his back porch, nursing a cold beer as the sound of laughter floated over from Harmony Park. The once quiet neighborhood seemed noisier these days. There were always kids playing, people chatting, or neighbors working together on some community project. To others, this might have seemed like progress. To John, it felt like his neighborhood. He thought back to the Harmony Estates of 15 years ago, when he and his wife, Deborah, first moved in. It was peaceful, orderly. The neighbors all knew each other, and things just worked. There weren't any listening sessions or cultural fairs. People minded their own business, and that's the way John liked it. Now, it seemed like everything had to be a statement. Nathan Porter and his inclusivity projects had turned Harmony Estates into something John barely recognized. It wasn't that John was against diversity. He told himself he didn't care about someone's background. He just didn't like being told he needed to change. Why fix what isn't broken? When John first came up with the idea for Harmony First, he hadn't planned for it to become a movement. It was just a way to gather like-minded neighbors who felt the same way he did, tired of all the new ideas that were making their way into the neighborhood. But the more he talked, the more people agreed. The flyers were just the beginning. That first meeting in his backyard had felt like validation. People like him, people who had lived in Harmony Estates for years, were uneasy about the changes. They didn't want to admit it publicly, but they were grateful to have a space where they could speak freely. John saw it as his duty to protect the neighborhood's character. "We're not trying to exclude anyone," John had told the group, "but we had to draw a line somewhere. If we let these new ideas take over, we'll lose what makes Harmony Estates special." Most of the group had nodded along, though John noticed a few hesitations, especially from Greg Jacobs. John didn't mind a little dissent, it was normal. But when Greg started defending Nathan at the meeting, it left a sour taste in John's mouth. John hadn't planned to attend the cultural fair. He had been adamantly against it from the start, seeing it as another attempt to force the neighborhood into becoming something it wasn't. But Deborah had convinced him to go. "We should at least see what it's about," she said over breakfast. "Maybe it's not as bad as you think." Reluctantly, John agreed, though he made sure to grumble about it the whole way there. When they arrived at Harmony Park, John was taken aback. The place was buzzing with activity. Booths lined the pathways, each one colorful and inviting. People mingled and laughed, sampling food and sharing stories. It was different from what he expected. For a moment, he considered turning around and leaving. But Deborah tugged at his arm. "Let's just look," she said. "We're already here." John followed her to a booth run by Elena Cruz, the new renter he had been wary of. She was serving empanadas and explaining the dish's history to a group of curious neighbors. John had to admit, the food smelled amazing. "Would you like to try one?" Elena asked, holding out a plate. Her smile was warm and genuine, catching John off guard. Sure," John muttered, taking an empanada. He bit into it, and his gruff demeanor softened. "This is really good." Elena's face lit up. "Thank you. It's my grandmother's recipe. She used to make these for every family gathering." Deborah joined the conversation, asking Elena about her family and how she was settling in. John stood awkwardly at first, but as Elena spoke, he found himself listening. She wasn't so different after all, just someone trying to make a better life for her kids. For the first time, John began to question whether he had judged her too quickly. Despite the fair's success, John couldn't shake his discomfort. The neighborhood felt like it was changing too fast, and he wasn't sure how to keep up. At the next Harmony First meeting, he shared his concerns. "I went to that fair," he admitted to the group. "It wasn't bad, but it's not what Harmony Estates used to be. I just don't want to lose what we have." A few people nodded in agreement, but Greg Jacobs, who had attended the meeting again, spoke up. "John, what exactly are we losing? The park looks better than ever. The neighbors are finally getting to know each other. Isn't that a good thing?" John bristled. "Maybe for you, Greg, but some of us don't want to be part of all these projects. What's wrong with just keeping things the way they are?" "The way things were," Greg said gently, "worked for some people, but not everyone. Don't you see how many people felt left out before? This isn't about taking anything away from you. It's about giving others a chance to feel like they belong." The group fell silent, and for the first time, John felt the weight of his resistance. Was he holding onto an idea of Harmony Estates that only worked for people like him? One evening, as John walked his dog around the neighborhood, he saw Nathan sitting on his porch, sipping tea. The two men exchanged a polite nod, and Nathan called out, "Evening, John." John hesitated, then approached. "Evening," he said gruffly. "Care for some tea?" Nathan offered, holding up his mug. John was about to decline, but something stopped him. "Sure," he said finally. As he sat on Nathan's porch, the two men talked, not about the neighborhood, but about life. Nathan shared stories from his years in law enforcement, while John talked about his early days in Harmony Estates. To his surprise, John found himself enjoying the conversation. "You know," Nathan said after a while, "change is hard. I get that. But I think Harmony Estates has the potential to be something really special. A place where everyone feels like they're part of the same story." John looked down at his mug, thinking, "I guess I just don't want to lose what made this place home for me." "You don't have to lose it," Nathan said, "but maybe it's time to make room for others to feel at home too." John didn't respond right away, but Nathan's words stayed with him long after he left the porch. Over the next few weeks, John began to soften, though he didn't fully let go of his reservations. He started small, helping Greg with a neighborhood project and chatting more with Elena when he saw her at the park. It wasn't a complete transformation, but it was a step. For John, the journey was slow and uncertain. He wasn't sure if he'd ever fully embrace the changes happening around him. But he was beginning to understand that resistance wasn't the answer. Maybe, just maybe, there was room for Harmony Estates to grow without losing its heart. And perhaps, he thought, there was room for him to grow too.